to Westside Student Life and CW Veterans Center Veterans Appreciation. And we are so happy that you are joining us today. And first off, I just want to say happy Veterans Day. And we just thank you very much for your service. If you were unable to join us in our previous session, we did record that, and I will be posting that on our Facebook and Instagram, and you'll be able to catch some of the topics that were discussed earlier. And so now I would like to introduce you to Ruben Cardenas. He's the director for our CW Veterans Center. And thank you, Ruben, for being here. And I will pass it off to you.
Thanks, Michelle. I do want to start off by saying thank you to Michelle and everyone else on our committee who worked hard to put together this event and our previous event before this. Today we have Heather Bahme with us. She is a Washington Department of Veterans Affairs regional coordinator located in Eastern Washington. And she is also the TBI program specialist for the state, who works closely with our other person, Dan, correct me, Heather? Overton. So they're doing a lot of hard work in relation to this topic. She's also a veteran of 22 years, so tip of the hat for your service, and thank you. I'm excited to listen to her presentation. This is applicable to anyone, whether you're a veteran or someone in the Veterans Support Network, like a family member. This is important information, and we need to get our veterans connected to the appropriate resources, especially if they are struggling with TBI injury. So I'll let Heather get started, and let's hold questions to the end, and you can put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to them as soon as the formal presentation is over.
All right. Thank you guys for inviting me. Thanks, Edwin. This is something that's actually incredibly close to for home for us. My husband is actually a TBI survivor, also being a veteran. And so this is something that really affects us personally as a family, but just affects the population as a whole. And that's one of the reasons that I feel that this is such a relevant topic, non-veteran or veteran, because of the fact that 1 in 5 individuals potentially could be walking around with a traumatic brain injury that's undiagnosed and doesn't even realize it, just because it's not something that there wasn't a lot of research. There's not a lot of knowledge about it. We have gotten farther kind of past into the knowledge piece to really kind of understand the injury and kind of the consequences of that injury, of having it. And, as we get farther down the road, we see even more research and data that is showing us how prevalent this is in just the human population as a whole. So here is, obviously my contact information. It will be on the very last slide as well. And then Ruben and Edwin will have all of our contact information, to include Dan, who is in the Olympia Central Office. And then I'm out here in Eastern Washington. So I'll make sure that you guys have all of that. So I'm going to start out here with just one. I don't know how great these videos are going to play, but hopefully we're going to give it a shot. So I could see in the text that you guys closed captioning. I don't know where the closed captioning, because I have closed captioning on my end for myself anyways, just because I wear hearing devices. Hopefully does that improve it? So let's try this one. Okay.
Axons crossing these junctions experience tremendous shearing forces, causing them to stretch and tear from the cell body. This event is called axonal shearing or diffuse axonal injury. Brain damage can continue to occur for hours or days after the initial injury. Damage to the axons can lead to a breakdown of communication among neurons in the brain. The torn axons quickly degenerate, releasing toxic levels of chemicals called neurotransmitters into the extracellular space. In turn, many of the surrounding neurons begin to die over the next 24 to 48 hours, worsening the initial effects of the injury.
So let's go with this. I'm going to try and see if I can adjust this so I can see the, there we go. Okay. So obviously I've showed you two videos that show you two different versions. So you see the brain cells and the axons that are dying off. This is just, I mean, I don't want to over kind of make this harder than it really is, because this is definitely the medical side of it. Medical folks just, you know, they're going to latch onto this pretty significantly. But I'm going to go with kind of, this is going to show us a traumatic brain injury. So we have mild. So when we think of a brain injury, we're thinking it on the mild, moderate, and severe. And when I say mild, moderate, and severe, keep in mind, a brain injury can happen in a multitude of ways. So for mild, you would have lost conscious for less than 30 minutes, and probably within 5 to 10 minutes. When you come into your moderate, you're going to be longer than 30 minutes. And then when we're talking severe, we're talking you could have been unconscious, and that's going to be upwards of 24 hours or more. And keep in mind, this is different for every single injury that is occurred. So this is just kind of giving us kind of an idea when we're talking about severity and brain injury. And the reality is because of the fact that it's not always so recognizable outwardly, like you don't see the injury. When we're talking severe, we're talking about there's going to be primary injuries that are going, then the TBI is going to be a secondary injury when we're talking upwards of loss of consciousness of 24 hours or more. So just so you kind of had a context as to when we were talking about mild, moderate, and severe. So I'm going to show you these two small videos, which are going to kind of, one of them is going to start, the other one will stop, and this will give you the brain injury and the changes that occur when a concussion happens. And I promise that we'll all come back into one, but I figured that we might as well get all the medical side done so that it makes a little bit more sense, so I don't, you know, kind of talk out of turn in case somebody doesn't understand the difference between different levels of a concussion. So I'm going to play this one.
To create shearing forces. As the gray matter, comprised of cell bodies, and the white matter, comprised of axons, are of two different densities, the shearing forces create a plane of cleavage where many axonal injuries occur. The axons may be completely torn, partially torn, or separated from their connections with other cells. Thousands or even millions of scattered axons may be torn. But unless some of the larger and more resilient arteries are also torn, no bleeding occurs. Traditional imaging studies such as CT or MRI are not new. CT and MRI are designed to detect blood, or after a period of time, the remnants of blood called hemosiderin. Large quantities of red blood cells must hemorrhage from a blood vessel or blood vessels to be detectable on CT.
So as you guys can see right here is that the hemocretin that he's referring to in this. This would be considered a concussion. And sometimes these can go easily misdiagnosed because of the fact that it's so easy for even the most, professional, radiologists to evaluate these. It's really difficult to actually put your finger on the fact that it could be a concussion. There's a lot of symptoms that have to go on as well as this injury for it to actually be a diagnosis. A brain injury is essentially brain damage. The most common injury is the concussion. Concussions are often not damage. The brain is enough to show up on a scan, but it's hardly fatal in this case. So many people just don't even think. I mean, I have 5 kids. I could probably put on one hand how many times that they've had a concussion, which is really scary that as a society, we don't put a lot of weight on that. I can promise you, I definitely recognize it more now than I did before, because you can see how just one concussion and the impact of that will affect them later on in life. And I will be able to show you that here down a little bit farther. So we're going to go down to this one here. I'm working on multiple screens. Sorry, guys. So this is a map of Seattle. So I want you guys to think of a brain injury kind of like a map. The network to be thought of, you see all the different streets that connect, all the connections. If you block a street, you have to find another connection. So now we're going to add a sinkhole to this. So this is a sinkhole in the middle of that map, if you think about it. So now you've broken those connections. So how do you get from this street here to this street without having to try and figure out another path to get all the way around to end up on the other side? The fact of the matter is this right here is all just that black hole. In effect, what's happening is the city or the sinkhole, the traffic is disrupted. And now you're having to find adaptation. You're going to have to adapt the situation because the fact you have this kind of this black hole right here. I'm not saying that you aren't going to be able to build these roads back across, but a lot of times it's not a matter of repairing this sinkhole. It's a matter of finding different ways to get the same things done because you don't have the availability to be able to use this. So this is a primary blast injury. So injury occurs every 9 seconds in the civilian, in just our civilian sector. In our military sector, this is every 4 to 6 seconds that a blast injury or, a concussion is going to occur. Blast injury is considered to be the most significant injury of our OIF and OEF and OND population. The funny thing is this is not just isolated to this generation. We're talking about, this is an injury that has been represented within the military from the beginning of time. It just wasn't something that was as recognized or even understood. I think that a lot of times we thought about it as being, there was a lot of PTSD, and I think that that's kind of the misnomer when we talk about TBI. So you have your initial blast injury, and you can see the Kevlar, the energy in the pulse. Now you have shrapnel. So this would be considered a secondary blast or a severe traumatic brain injury. And this is a tertiary blast injury. Now you've affected essentially your frontal lobe and your occipital lobe. And that is essentially from the blast wave and your brain going forward and back within your skull. That is actually going to break those axons, which can cause the most significant damage, even more than sometimes even the shrapnel, because the brain is resilient as it is. It's not going to necessarily be able to repair it. This can be healed. Something like this, we still today don't have a clear understanding on how the brain is able to repair itself in this fashion. And that's where the research is so important for us. So I'm sure that everybody knows who this is, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. This is Aaron Hernandez. He was a professional football player. And then we have this. And I'm sure that people recognize this Aaron Hernandez as well. So Aaron was a former tight end for the New England Patriots, and he was convicted of murdering his friend, Odin Lloyd. And the reality is, at the time, you don't understand. I think everybody's looking at the criminal side of this, and I'm certainly not giving him a pass by any stretch of the imagination. While on trial, Lloyd's murder, Hernandez was charged with shooting and killing 2 other men on top of this, and essentially he was acquitted in 2017 of these crimes. And then in his prison cell, he took his own life. The part that's kind of scary is the team at Boston University and researchers were asked to examine Aaron Hernandez's brain. Keep in mind, he'd been playing football since the age of, I think they could take it back to the age of 4. So they couldn't even go through and count how many possible concussions he might have suffered during that time, not to mention there was said that he had some childhood trauma that could have equated to some of that as well. So I want to draw your attention to this slide. So when they're talking about research of the brain, they're talking about taking the brain and they take a very thin slice. So this is what a normal, very small slice. I mean, we're talking like paper thin, probably even, I mean, it's microbial thin. And this is what it would look like underneath a microscope of a normal brain. So this right here is what that same slice would look in a brain that has CTE. So this here is a normal brain. This right here on the bottom is Aaron Hernandez's brain. So Boston University was able to take these scans and you can actually see the damage from the CTE that affected his brain. So I'm going to play this video and you shouldn't hear anything. I just want you to watch it. So as you can see the wave, the blast wave, as it's coming toward the vehicle. So on the right, you're going to see this slide right here, the reflected shock. So this is the actual wave that you're watching hitting somebody in this APC. So the red part, this is brain pressure and wave. This is the pressure here. Now you've got damage in here. This is your frontal lobe. And these are different areas that you're going to see that pressure change. So now you've got the coup injury, the reflected shock, your counter coup injury, and your incident shock. They reported that by evaluating this, research points the recurrent subconcussive event that you're seeing in this blast wave is we've all, you can actually be sitting in a car and cars will have their speakers turned up really loud and you can actually feel the kind of the vibration from the music. So imagine that about 20 times even more significant. And if I was to have the sound on, I don't think the sound actually would be, you would be able to hear it. But it's significant. The blast injury feels like being hit by a wave, then being pulled back into the ocean. It's initially a rapid succession by it playing over and over again. Sorry guys, I'm having to move different slides down so I can read my notes. So the blast overpressurization wave generated by the explosion travels at a high velocity and is affected by the surrounding environment. For example, the effect of the blast wave may be increased in a closed environment such as a vehicle. So there's somebody standing on top of this APC, but what is affecting the folks that are actually inside is just as significant as what's happening on the outside. Air-filled organs such as an ear, lung, gastrointestinal tract, as well as your organs surrounded by fluid-filled cavities such as your brain, spinal cord, especially susceptible to primary blast injuries. So here's another, I'm going to go to this one right here. So as you can see, you see the sand and all of the debris that is coming off these soldiers as they're setting off this mortar round. So like football players, they will receive a TBI as part of their job. The fact of the matter is veterans are exposed to this on a regular basis, just like football players and professional athletes. They will often not realize that they've had one no blood drink. Basically, will often not realize that they've had one. For example, the dust is coming off all the soldiers is due to the blast wave coming from the portable mortar round. With rapid blast exposure, it could seem that our soldiers would be subject to CTE like football players. And so within this recent study, we are able to actually see this. So this is a control subject. So Colorado has been doing a lot of Department of the Army and Department of Defense and Department of Justice have started a research study that they back in 2012. And as it has gotten farther, we've been able to use control subjects, and we can actually see the difference in different test subjects when it comes to blast injury. So our control subject would be somebody that has never suffered a traumatic brain injury or ever had any kind of injury related that could be diagnosed as a concussion at all. So now this is your Alzheimer's patient. So this is going to show you the brain capacity in a patient that is diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So now you've got a football player. So the red is showing you the overactive areas of the brain. And then you've got your military. So as you can see, if you compare, so an Alzheimer's patient who is essentially losing parts of their memory, you can see where the most active part of your brain, right? This would be this is the memory section of your brain right here. On this cross section, you can see that the memory section is fading. Now we go to the football player, you see it's red because it's overactive. That means that the brain is actually working twice as hard to be able to complete those same tasks that this brain is having to complete. And this right here is showing you the damage that essentially is under study right now to the impact of, lifelong. Right now we're still in the, the research that's coming out is significant, but at the end of the day, I think that many doctors would still say that there's still a lot we need to know before we can make a definitive decision on if this is something that can be reversible or if it's something that we can prevent. Now you can see our military personnel. So the brain to a football player and the brain to somebody that served in the military, it's pretty significant. It's I would probably say is just as impactful versus our control subject who has never suffered any kind of brain injury whatsoever. So let me go here.
Protein called tau. Usually, tau proteins support tiny tubes inside our axons, called microtubules. It's thought that repeated subconcussive hits damage the microtubules, causing the tau proteins to dislodge and clump together. The clumps disrupt transport and communication along the neuron and drive the breakdown of connections within the brain. Once the tau proteins start clumping together, they cause more clumps to form and continue to spread throughout the brain even after head impacts have stopped. The data show.
So our veterans are especially at risk. Like football players, they'll receive TBIs as a part of their job. And like football players, they will often realize they have had such a significant, the interruption that's going, and at the time of the injury, I don't know that many of our veterans even just our civilian counterparts, I don't know that after somebody has suffered a traumatic brain injury or concussion, that their first thought is going to what they aren't doing the same rather than just the fact that they maybe just have a terrible headache. I think that diffusion and tensor image, they call this tractograph. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with that word. And it could just be that I'm trying to listen to my closed captioning too. Dramatic, this right here is a typical normal brain. So this is somebody who's never had any kind of blast injury, any kind of head injury, never had a diagnosis of any concussion. This could be somebody in the service, it could be somebody civilian. This is what a brain would look like essentially immediately after a concussion. This is an actual PET scan of that injury. And so you can see where, for example, I think the best way to describe this is it's like a plate of spaghetti. This has very clear paths that you can see the neurons and the axons, have clear paths and runways and roads, and where then this one kind of looks like a hot mess. And this you can definitely see the interruption of all of these different neurons and these axons that are going to, directly impact this individual potentially, you know, for time to come. You know, it's hard to say. I mean, we don't have, you know, when we talk about injury, we're always talking about diagnosis and then, you know, the rehab to repair that. TBI is not something that we have a magic pill that we can fix. It's something that essentially will be with you probably a lifetime. I don't think my husband ever once thought that playing football was something that was going to impact him, you know, into, you know, later into his years, until he realized, you know, that suffering a traumatic brain injury in the service and then playing semi-pro football prior to joining the military and then after joining the military actually was adding to the already damage that he potentially already had. So researchers in the Military Brain Injury Studies Program at the Uniformed Service University of the Health Service Plan to similarly map the brain of a deceased veteran, recent changes to assess blast effects. Slides of delicate brain tissue below hold crucial clues. I think I know the blast force does to a human brain, says program director David Perrell. So David Perrell, when he was able to actually put this on a slide, it spoke volumes for what they'd been trying to speak for years, that there was long-term effects for brain injury, even on the most mild concussion side of the fence. You know, this, I would probably, if I was to take a look at just the data and the science that go with this right here is a mild to moderate brain injury. This would be a concussion that you easily could sustain slipping off some stairs and hitting your head. And, you know, people don't think of a moderate brain injury as something that's, you know, life altering, but just by the pictures, you can tell the difference on how the brain is adapting to that injury. Just something so simple as slipping and falling. So they, during this study that they were evaluating, they essentially set up this schematic. So this is the mouse, this is an air tank. And so basically they're creating this blast injury within this model. And this is what happens to the brain of that mouse from that blast, from this blast of air. And so that would be a blast injury or a concussive blast to some of our veterans that have, you know, that have been unfortunate enough to sustain that. You don't even realize how much the brain can actually move until you actually can see just the movement alone. There is significant, there could be significant damage. So in this study, just one blast can cause significant damage. So again, these are the very thin slices of the brain, and this is what that brain looks magnified 100 plus times. And so you can actually see this red area right here is where the issue comes into play. These are actual connections and, you know, just different paths that your brain uses to perform everyday functions. Getting dressed, brushing your teeth, listening to your wife in the kitchen. I don't know how many times I've had to tell my husband, he'll ask me something 5 times and he will walk out of the house and walk back in and say, what did you remind me I needed to do? Because that short-term memory that is affected, his short-term memory is impacted probably more than maybe his like long-term memory. So he remembers things that happened 10, 15 years ago, but I could, you know, tell him he has to go and, you know, pick up the mail and, you know, go to the bank for me. And he will have to call me 4 more times after the 5 times at breakfast, the 1 time he walked back into the house, and then the 4 more times that he sent me a text message. Because for some reason he can't remember it. But if somebody asked him what he had, you know, what he had for that amazing football, the meal for that football game that they won state championship, he'd probably be able to tell you. So, you know, we always joke that he always has to count the kids when they get in the car, because there's been a few times where he's gotten into the car and he's almost driven away without a kid, because he just, that that ability to stop and think about it was greatly impacted. And so now he stops and makes them count. And if he doesn't hear, 4 or 5, depending on who's with us and who's not, then he'll start asking a few more questions. So even just one blast is significant enough. It is believed to be able to contribute to PTSD. So the problem, I think, that, and the misnomer that we talk about traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress is the fact that they mirror each other. So the symptoms that one would suffer with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury actually are the same symptoms. So I'm going to show you this. This is going to be without a concussion. So this is the working memory of somebody without a concussion. This is your working memory with somebody after a concussion. This, on the frontal part here, this is going to be, so this is your right, and then this is your left. This is your frontal lobe, and this is your occipital lobe. So this is going to be your number processing area right in here. So this red is showing the brain having to work 10 times harder to process that memory and that motor planning and that processing of numbers and just everyday function that somebody without a concussion is doing. So this becomes incredibly fatiguing. This is what is so frustrating to many that suffer traumatic brain injury, because they're working so hard to do the same tasks that they've always done, but by having to work this hard, it's just that mental fatigue. And the first thing that is to fail in somebody that's struggling with a traumatic brain injury is going to be their memory, because stress is one of those things that causes our folks to just, their memory is the first one to go when stress is kind of added to that mix. So I'm going to give you guys some symptoms, common symptoms. So some of the main issues that are common to traumatic brain injury. So it highly affects your behavior. It's going to affect your emotional aspect. And then it's going to affect your cognition. And then in TBI increases the risk for depression by 150%. Substance abuse is increased by 63%. Incarceration puts them at a risk of more than 200%. And then suicide, that is an increase of 300%. So just by adding TBI onto a diagnosis, you've increased the odds by 150 to 300% for this population. And this is just, we're talking about veterans right now, but we're talking about just the civilian, just our population in general, the human population in general. I don't think folks realize that this plays a significant part in our mental and behavioral health when we're talking depression, substance abuse, incarceration, and suicide, and there's a reason for that. So the occurrence of TBI among intimate partner violence offenders is significantly higher than occurrence of TBI within the general population. So, and this has a lot to do with a lot of our emotional and our impulse control and frustration, I would believe. And what can we do? So for students, I think that it's important to know that I think that when we work with kids, we are in the, when we're trying to teach our children, the reality is kids have to do something at least 100 times. So for them to learn to walk, they had to make that attempt to learn to walk 100 times before they could make that first step. So imagine somebody that's had a brain injury, they've served in the military, they don't know they're suffering from a traumatic brain injury. They kind of have the knowledge that they probably are suffering from symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and maybe they even have a diagnosis for post-traumatic stress. And I think that the VA has gotten to the point where post-traumatic stress is one of the #1 diagnosis of the military forces these days. And that is they're quick to judge, and they're quick to put that label on it. And that, I think, is to a detriment, but it's also because we're not asking the right questions. The fact of the matter is our students that are attending school, they're trying to manage this diagnosis of post-traumatic stress, But once they've added post-traumatic stress, now you've added stress, you've added just the everyday aspect of going to school. The reality is the syllabus becomes incredibly important, just that the writing of a lot of this information so that they're successful in school. I know that, there's a lot of visual learners, there's a lot of physical learners. There's some people that need to do both. They have to visualize it, they have to actually perform it. And doing it at least 100 times, having to relearn those skills that they didn't normally have to do is incredibly frustrating to somebody that just spent 10 years in the military, 2 years in the military, 22 years in the military. I mean, the fact of the matter is they feel like, wow, this is something I should be able to do. I don't understand why I'm struggling. This is not a hard concept. But the fact of the matter is when there's an injury that's going undiagnosed because we're not asking the right questions, and then the VA goes ahead and they prescribe their medications because, that's what you do in some cases when it comes to post-traumatic stress. The problem is it's going to improve some of those symptoms of post-traumatic stress, but it's going to impact the traumatic brain injury one because those are not being addressed. And so I think that was kind of the aha moment for at least for many veterans is they're taking medicine or they're getting treatment and they're seeing their counselor on a regular basis when it comes to their post-traumatic stress, and they're addressing those issues. The problem is those issues are getting better, but these other ones are not, and they can't understand why the rest of these symptoms are not improving or changing or getting better. In fact, in some cases, some of those are getting worse. So what they're realizing is because there isn't a magic pill to cure traumatic brain injury, that diagnosis is kind of left to the wayside. In fact, that sometimes that's not even brought into consideration. Up until about 2 years ago, the VA actually, unless you were diagnosed with a severe brain injury, that was not a question that was even brought into the mix. Those were not even questions that were being asked. And even if there was records to prove that you had suffered a blast injury or had been in a situation that you could have been in proximity to have suffered a blast injury. Those questions still, and they're still very short, they're slow to make that diagnosis because of the fact that is a permanent, that's not something that's going to improve. And a lot of our neurologists feel like they're not willing to put that label on it just yet because they know that it's not going to be something that they can reverse. So I think the research is going to be is key for us to be able to put this as one of the key injuries for this group of soldiers that are coming out. But not only that, even our Vietnam vets, our World War II vets, they've been struggling for years with this same exact injury, and it's coping skills. The reality is the only thing that we have found that's successful to treat traumatic brain injury is coping skills and tools to assist them in doing the same skills the same activities that they were doing prior. They sometimes need some other tools to kind of still be able to perform those same tasks. So I think the assumption when we label somebody and we say traumatic brain injury is we assume that person or that they just don't have that cognition to be able to make that recall that there's something different. And when we talk about injury, we're talking about something we can see. Well, traumatic brain injury is one of those invisible wounds because you don't see the injury, so you assume that it's something that is not real, or it's not like you've got a label walking around saying I have a traumatic brain injury. I can't remember, sometimes I have to be reminded, 3 or 4 times, or sometimes I forget, in the middle of a sentence, I forget what I'm talking about, and I have to be, reminded, that, they're worth the time of asking those tough questions that, things are different, but they're not lost completely. And then acceptance. And this is one that we find significant, at least with our population. And the reason being is that this one is to accept this injury is almost, I think, is as bad as for us as saying that we need help with something that somebody can't see. And a lot of people, I get posed this question often by different agencies. Do I think that they're making excuses because it's just harder than they expected? And I get that a lot sometimes from students that we're working with on different campuses. And, I have to say that Central and a lot of our larger state universities have done a really good job with their disability support systems, agencies and stuff, with making that direct connection with that invisible wound to be able to help our folks that are suffering potentially from traumatic brain injury and don't even realize it. So, I think that it's important to understand that these are definitely some symptoms that would kind of lead you down the path of understanding that maybe you should ask if there is a possibility that there could have been a brain injury or there could have been a concussion. And I think that it's fair to say that, short-term memory loss, trouble focusing or attention. I think that impulse control, we see this in children, especially, the younger grades, they're very quick to diagnose and they're having trouble focusing or they have got attention deficit disorders. This is something that affects just the normal adult population anyways, not even with brain injury. So this is kind of like a, I think a key blanket, oh, you have trouble focusing or you can't pay attention. The neurofatigue, this is that running out of energy. This is your brain working 10 times harder to complete that task of remembering that grocery list that somebody provided them, and they got to the grocery store and they couldn't remember anything on that list without it being written down. Dizziness and balance issues. Traumatic brain injury does have the ability to impact the inner ear and the dizziness and your balance. So vertigo is a huge symptom of traumatic brain injury. And the funny thing is I will get a veteran that will reach out and they're like, well, I've been diagnosed with vertigo and I have all these other diagnoses, but the one diagnosis that they don't have is traumatic brain injury. But they have vertigo, they have cognitive deficit, they have aphasia, they're not able to they get overstimulated by loud noises and large groups. Well, they would say a lot of veterans struggle in large groups anyways. And that's probably true in some cases, but I think that when we talk about overstimulation and groups, large groups and noises, it's because their inner ear has been affected, which is causing the vertigo for one. And then two, the noises, it's causing them to hear at a higher decibel range, which then is overstimulating their brain. And then you have anxiety about the slightest thing. Well, all these things are just setting somebody up to be they're at the tip of that, going over the deep end because they have no control of any of these symptoms that then the anxiety that sets in then can play a part in their depression and chronic pain. Chronic pain tends to be a side effect of all of these. And then, it's funny, I'll see this as a diagnosis all the time too. And never once have they ever been asked, was there a chance that you suffered a concussion while you were on active duty? And they will actually have the actual, the records to prove the injury. But never once has there ever been an evaluation for traumatic brain injury. They have had evaluations to have diagnosis for all of this, but not one will have an evaluation for traumatic brain injury. So I think that, when we're talking about our students that are coming in and they're struggling, I think it's important to make sure that, sometimes we get students that will come in a lot that will say that, they're just they're overtaxed. And I think that we just need to start asking some more of these questions that might lead you down the path of, have you ever been tested for traumatic brain injury? So brain injury is one of those things, like I said, you are not going to be able to take a pill and it's going to cure it. You're not going to have physical therapy that's going to improve it. But there are ways that we can adapt. And, the reality is humans are amazing individuals. And the fact of the matter is we find new ways to get the same thing done all the time. And I don't even think we realize that we've adapted as we get older, we adapt just different things to make those daily chores easier. So I think that that's one of the reasons that traumatic brain injury is not one of the top diagnoses. It's one of those things that's kind of a fleeting idea at the very end when they don't have answers for all the other stuff that they've addressed. Then they were starting to really kind of come full circle and say, I wonder if there's a chance that maybe you have suffered a traumatic brain injury. And what are you doing to adapt that you find yourself doing differently than you have before because you're struggling in this area of, short-term memory. Fighting never seems to work well. And the same with the TBI. You can focus on what you have and what you don't have more, or focus on what you still have for later. Easier said than done. The one thing I could say is, telling somebody that a concussion is something that could essentially come back and revisit them. I'm pretty sure that, your 18-year-old self never once thought that that concussion you might have sustained, however you sustained it, you were going to be revisiting at the age of 48 or 45, even if it wasn't something that you got while you were in service. But the reality is there's enough history or research to show that initial injury at 18 years old is there's long-term effects for just the human population in general, that I don't think that we're doing. I don't think that we have been at, in the forefront of explaining that to, with the initial injury. And, hindsight being 2020, I think that a lot of professional players, football players, would turn around and say, gosh, if I had known this, this could have made all the difference. So Edwin, I know that you have used this app, this Max Impact app. It is in the iOS, it's in the Apple store. It's also in our Android store. This app was designed by the Washington Department of Veterans Affairs. We spent about 4 years designing it. This is not, obviously we work strictly with veterans, but the reality is I probably see just as many veterans as I see civilian that have never served a day in their life. When we're talking brain injury. And this tool right here is an app that can go on your phone. We don't collect any of the data from it. It's completely voluntary. Up in the right-hand corner, you have access to the emergency hotlines, as well as there is a link in here for the IPV for domestic violence. And so you can be directly connected with counselors for that. This also has a button on here for resources, and it's broke out for our state. So if you were to put in your region and say you're looking for a specific resource related to your region, it will generate it if it's in here. If for some reason you know of a resource that would serve a veteran or even a civilian, because like I said, there's many civilians that use this app, it's always good to let us know, because we have the ability to go in and add that resource, as well as update the resource if for some reason it's incorrect. This resource also has games. And when I say games, the reality is your brain is a muscle. We are constantly having to exercise it and keep it sharp. And the reality is sometimes very simple memory games can make the difference on that cognition piece. I can promise you that my husband he will sit and I will ask him, why are you still playing that? And he's like, well, I don't have to think about it. And I think in some ways it's relaxing because it doesn't take a lot of thought. And that kind of helps with that mental fatigue, so that then he can go back and, for 20 minutes, and then he can go back and spend the rest of his day having to use those areas that sometimes he struggles in recalling, especially when he's, since COVID, he actually has multiple jobs now. Sorry, I thought that it was up there. Okay, here we go. There you go. So here's your TBI support. And like I said, so we are not collecting any data. So on a normal app, there's a part where we can actually, whoever designs an app, you can actually get the analytics from it. we don't, it's completely voluntary. So all of this, and this actually has a diagnosis. There is a key here, and this will go into your TBI resources, and it will help you. Like, it will go through and ask you questions, and it will kind of give you, hey, I think there's a chance you're suffering from a traumatic brain injury. I also have access, I have the actual, we call it a diagnosis key. And it basically is we give it to some of our veterans that, sometimes that are struggling, to say, hey, is there a chance maybe you've suffered a concussion of some sort? And we're able to then to give them this tool. They can fill it out, and then they add it up at the end, and they can actually take that to their doctor and say, you know what, I think that there might be a chance I'd like to be evaluated for traumatic brain injury. And then you've got your TBI community. There's different resources. A lot of our community, TBI community, we had a lot of support groups prior to COVID. A lot of our TBI resources have gone virtual. And so there's a lot of support groups that way. Here in Eastern Washington, depending on what area we're in and what, I guess, what point in COVID we're at, some of those more rural areas are able to still meet for some of our support groups, especially in our rural communities, Stevens, Ponderay counties. And so that is something that's really important to this population. They really depend highly on those support groups. On the west side, I feel terrible because they've actually, once you cross over the mountains, they have had no support groups. Everything's been done virtually, and to try and convert folks from going to a support group in person to going to a support group online has been a challenge for them. And so it's something we're still trying to manage for these folks. So I will leave this at questions on this one. And then here's my contact information. And then I will make sure that, I guess I thought that Dan's stuff was on here. Ruben and Edwin can send out these slides, and they can add Dan's contact information on the slide that you guys get sent out. So these slides you guys will have access to. They won't be locked. You guys can change them, update them, and use them however you guys think are the most beneficial for your audience. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody? Anybody want to see another slide?
I don't have a question or anything, but I just think it's great that we're getting this information out there. Just because every time that I see this presentation, I'm learning something new.
Well, there was a new report that came out last week that even has, it's 736 pages of research that has come out in the last week that is going to, I won't lie, it's kind of like reading War and Peace sometimes. When you go to bed, you're definitely going to want to read it to go to sleep, but that's a lot of research that definitely could be a game changer for our civilian population as well as our veteran population when it comes to traumatic brain injury, and just the coping skills that, if we had a clear diagnosis for our populations, it really could be the difference between being successful and not wanting to complete certain tasks, especially when we're talking about higher ed. Our goal is for veterans to start school and to stay in school. The reality is sometimes traumatic brain injury is not something that's even on their radar. So it can greatly impact their ability to be super successful in their mind. And they didn't even know to ask those questions. And I'd like to think that we are a little bit forward thinking at this point of the game, and we're asking those tough questions now. But on the same token, I think it's hard for a lot of folks to think that could be a direct result as to maybe some of this struggle that they're having.
Thanks, Heather. I really enjoyed the presentation. I especially liked the slide where you had the different statistics of TBI survivors that, they're more likely to be incarcerated. I found that fascinating. I hadn't seen that data before. It's really eye-opening thinking about how much we go through life and how much we think our experiences and our personality can determine our outcomes. And then you see a slide like this and realize that, yeah, you know, TBI, the impacts go way beyond just the initial injury. It can stick with you for a long time.
So currently they're saying that if you served in the military, 1 in 5, it's actually higher of, they're actually saying now it's more like 2, sometimes 2.5 to 5 are walking around with a traumatic brain injury and never even thought about it. So if you think about that, now put that on our civilian population, this 300% right here, I mean, not just to the veteran population, but just to the population in general, 300%. How impactful that if we were asking this question right here, maybe we could impact this action for suicide not happening, or just improving those numbers together. But not just that, I mean, the incarceration of 200% is so significant. If we were to take, they're saying I think it's 7 in 10 incarcerated individuals are suffering from brain injury. And usually they had it before they went in to jail, and then they will then suffer another. So once you've suffered one brain injury, you are 10 times more likely to then suffer another brain injury. Does anybody have any other, anything else that they'd like to have me go back to? Or any questions?
Well, Heather, I just want to say thank you so much for coming in today and presenting this really important topic. It is so important for our students, and I'll be sure to post this on our social media so other students who were not able to attend this session can watch it on their own time. And
Edwin, I think you can download that, so that, because I tried to send it, it was so big. So I think he has access to pulling it down so that he can get it to you guys, because otherwise I'd have to zip it and send it to you guys, I think.
Yeah, and so just on behalf of Westside Student Life and our Veterans Center here, we just want to thank you so much again for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.